Union of Socialist Republics. Lenin saw it as a decentralized system, with each socialist republic having considerable power over their own affairs. Stalin saw it very differently. He wanted it ruled from the center. He wanted Russia as the dominant force, Moscow as the center of power, and preferably himself running the whole thing. It was quite surprising, given that he himself was Georgian.
At the same time as this new state was being established, its leader was falling into a terrible state of health. A series of strokes would render Lenin unable to speak, and a new leader would soon be needed. One man had long been plotting for the position, and he would eventually become one of the most powerful and feared figures in the whole world. In January 1924, Vladimir Lenin died. The battle for succession of leadership in the Soviet Union was now truly underway, with one man, Stalin, determined to come out on top.
And then on January 21st, 1924, the moon-faced, balding dictator left the scene as abruptly as he had appeared. He literally died of overwork. His funeral was a monstrous affair. Hundreds of thousands queued up in the streets in 25 degrees below zero weather. It seemed that everyone wanted to pay their last respects.
Stalin removed his rivals systematically with incredible ingenuity and in such a way they didn't know it was happening.
Lenin's great fear, I think, was that Stalin would develop a personality cult, a cult that had already developed around Lenin himself. And in fact, Stalin exploited this. He built up the cult of Lenin. When Lenin died, he took charge of the funeral arrangements. He wanted to have complete control of what happened to Lenin's legacy. It was Stalin who wanted Lenin's body to be embalmed, much against the wishes of Lenin's widow. And once Lenin was dead, this personality cult was transferred onto Stalin himself, and this would become one of the hallmarks of his entire reign of power in the Soviet Union.
Stalin was left as the sort of leading member of the leadership, along with Trotsky. And there were other major figures, Zinoviev and Kamenev, and younger ones like Bukharin as well, and Rykov, who were also key figures. But the leading two contenders were Stalin and Trotsky. And even though this is always presented as one of the great sort of struggles, and it was an amazing thing that Stalin won this succession struggle, actually, he'd really already won it by the time Lenin died. He was already the leading figure in the regime. And, somebody had to do something pretty radical to stop him. He already controlled the party machine, and the party controlled the country. So Trotsky was actually his ideal competitor. Trotsky was very arrogant and so famous and so preeminent and so pleased with himself that he really believed that he didn't need to do much organizing, and he would simply be given the leadership.
The first thing he did was to tell Trotsky he needed a rest and suggested that Trotsky go to the Caucasus. And Trotsky, who, although a very powerful figure, could be at times hysterical and have fainting fits and feel suddenly psychosomatically ill, Trotsky consented and he went pheasant shooting. And the instructions Stalin sent to the locals was he was not to meet anybody, he was not to receive any telegrams or letters. So Trotsky missed Lenin's funeral, and people who miss funerals miss the will reading and miss the distribution of the spoils.
Stalin's maneuvers during Lenin's funeral would be the beginning of the end for Leon Trotsky's role in the newly formed USSR, and the beginning of Stalin's radical plans for the nation.
Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev forced Trotsky into exile. Then Stalin overrules his two associates and ends the new economic policy. In its place come three successive five-year plans, all designed to emphasize productive capacity, especially heavy industry and power output. From 1928 to 1941, Russia's industrial capacity rises nearly 300%.
After the Civil
While the USSR would eventually be officially recognized on the world stage, it continued to have extremely tense relationships with foreign powers. But one of the USSR's surprising opportunities for industrial development in this time was with the country it had been in direct conflict with just a few years prior during World War I, Germany.
Germany, after the First World War, was a pariah state. It wasn't allowed to have an army, wasn't allowed to have tanks or aeroplanes. So it came to agreement with another pariah state, the Soviet Union, and they developed submarines, tanks, and aircraft in various sites on the Volga.
Well, this was the first socialist country in the world, so it was a tremendous experiment in transforming an economic system, modernize the country to build hydroelectric dams, to build the economy. The Soviet economic elite decided that centralized economic planning would be the most efficient way to mobilize resources. So targets were set for every sector of the economy by the center, and orders were given to all parts of the economy to fulfill their parts of the plan. So initially, they recognized that they needed to build infrastructure and heavy industries, the transportation, energy sector, and machine manufacturing in order to provide the capacity to then develop the economy further into consumer goods and a broad-based economy. But everything was mobilized toward the plan.
And so Stalin, in the end, embraced the extreme leftist view of communism, which was collectivize, eliminate all property, but also to make this into a great power and to promote industrialization. And the best way to do that was to collectivize the fields and the farms and then sell the grain abroad and buy technology to industrialize the country. And that was the policy he decided on. So it was a radical policy. And by about 1928, he decided that that was the only way to go, to make the Soviet Union a great power and to ensure the survival of the USSR. And that was what he decided to do. And he would do it at any cost.
The economic policy enacted by Joseph Stalin in the late 1920s would lead to a wide-scale famine across the whole of the USSR.
He did it by, first of all, introducing a policy of collective farms. They had been tried briefly in the 1920s and found that peasants didn't want to have their horses owned collectively and rebelled against it, and that was quickly abandoned. And then he tried again in 1929, and this time it was organized with the help of the Red Army, and it is said for the first time in Russian history, peasants ate all the meat they wanted to, because rather than hand over their pigs and sheep and cows, they just had an enormous feast and ate as much as they could.
One of both Lenin's policies and Stalin's policies was the destruction of the wealthy farming class, the yeoman farmers, if you like. These are farmers who had quite a lot of land and produced a lot of produce which they would then sell on. This was deemed unacceptable to the Bolshevik regime, and they were to be liquidated. And other farmers, the smaller peasant farmers, were to be gathered into collective farms and produce grain and supplies for the benefit of the state. This was an absolute disaster because on the one hand, Stalin had wiped out the one class of farmers that produced a surplus, and there was no longer any incentive for the rest of the peasant farmers to produce any food that was going to be taken from them anyway. What happens next is the Great Famine of the early 1930s.
The regime would not listen to signals from below. They wouldn't listen to the fact that there was no seed to plant, and they insisted on high quotas anyway. And this led to an even worse harvest the next year with loss of life and devastation, mostly in Ukraine because this was the main grain growing area, but it would also affected parts of southern Siberia and eastern Russia as well. So historians who've looked very closely at this don't believe this was a deliberate attack on Ukrainian nationalism or Ukrainian independence. It was just a terribly tragic manifestation of mistakes made in economic planning and an unwillingness to collect unbiased information but rather trying to believe the most rosy predictions and reports rather than the actual reports.
Records weren't kept properly, but we know how many people died simply because of the census report, that in 1937 there are about 12 million people missing from the population. Well, they shot the people who took the census, and they had a new census which was faked. And the problem with this famine was that there was a depression going on all over Europe and so on, and there wasn't much demand for buying grain from the Soviet Union, so the price wasn't good. They had to sell more and more in order to finance their industrialization. So that famine killed an enormous number of people, between 10 million and perhaps 15 million, because it happened not only to Ukrainians, it happened to Russian farmers. There was a sort of insanity about it, the agricultural policy. And the workers, I think, party workers got quite cynical. They realized their job was to destroy. So vineyards were torn up and farms destroyed. Animals destroyed. The grain wasn't even stored properly. It rotted in great railway sidings. So it was a form of madness. But it did solve one problem. It got rid of the peasantry as a force. Those who survived were cowed.
But it was not just the peasantry that was terrorized. The very leadership of the government and the original Bolshevik revolutionaries would also be targeted.
He would take his old Bolshevik comrades, many of whom had helped him maneuver him into the position of absolute power, and he would proceed to liquidate them in these show trials that took place in Moscow. Men like Kamenev, like Zinoviev were put on trial on trumped-up charges, and there was never any doubt that they were going to be found guilty. And he really went through many of his old Bolshevik comrades. They were put on trial, they were found guilty, and they were executed. It was absolutely brutal.
These are also the years of the great executions called Yezhovshchina, in honor of Stalin's executioner, N.I. Yezhov. How many people are permanently removed from circulation? No one knows. In some provinces, as much as 4% of the population vanishes. Kamenev and Zinoviev, who helped Stalin seize power, are quickly disposed of. To have been a friend of either one of them is now a crime. For this and related activities, well over half of the top communist leadership and thousands of lesser officials vanish, as do most of the army officers.
Well, the show trials were masterpieces of propaganda. They were meant to be public displays of crime and punishment, and they were carefully rehearsed, they were carefully prepared. Those that were sentenced in these trials, their confessions were scripted. Hundreds of people were invited to witness them. They were covered by the media, and they were an attempt to prove to the people at large that there were enemies in the country, and that Stalin was doing a good job of finding them and rooting them out. It was also a demonstration to foreign governments that the Soviet Union was intent on preserving its integrity.
And Stalin was helped by his chief of police at the time, who was a decadent poet and who had a lot to do with the theatre. And if you know the Stanislavski method of acting, which still survives today, the Stanislavski method of acting is very destructive for the actor because it tells the actor, you've got to be whoever you are. And prisoners, when arrested and interrogated, were trained just as Stanislavski trained actors. Their trials were rehearsed. So when they appeared in court, they would say, yes, I'm terribly guilty. I've been a Japanese spy all my life. And they would then, of course, make mistakes, saying they'd met somebody in a hotel which hadn't existed for 40 years. A lot of foreigners were convinced, quite influential foreigners, historians like Christopher Hill, Bernard Shaw, people who you thought had more brains, were convinced, oh, if he says he's guilty, he must be guilty.
A very few of Yezhov's victims are given trials. Some of the trials are remarkable. For example, several defendants are convicted of conspiring with Trotsky in 1936 in the Hotel Bristol in Copenhagen. In actual fact, in 1936, the hotel was no longer in business. Next case, in 1938, Yezhov himself is purged, together with many purged judges, labor camp operators, and the like.
His basic plan was, you know, when he looked at the Soviet Union, he saw there was disloyalty in the party. A lot of people wanted to get rid of him. A lot of people weren't happy with his collectivization policy and the suffering of the peasants. You know, there was disloyalty in his own family. And, you know, also the party bosses had become like little princes running their own territories. So he decided the way to deal with this was by bloodshed, by terror, quite deliberately. And he launched the Great Terror in 1935-36, in which over 1 million people, basically innocent, were executed.
This is also a time when there's a great expansion of the gulags. These are prison camps, often in far-flung places in Siberia, miles from anywhere, where political prisoners, troublemakers, or anyone deemed to be hostile to the regime would be sent off there, often walking there under unspeakable conditions, and they'd be simply locked away. And they'd have to work. They were forced labour camps. They were fed very little food. They were held in the most primitive conditions. You know, in the depths of winter in Siberia, it was freezing cold, and millions, maybe 1.5 million, 2 million people died in these camps. But it meant that by the end of the 1930s, Stalin was absolute master of the Soviet Union. He had simply wiped out anyone who could challenge his leadership.
Some 2,000 delegates who were at the 1934 Communist Party Congress, 2/3 of them would have lost their lives by the end of the Great Terror. So the leadership was disproportionately targeted. But there were many other victims as well. Other whole groups of victims were members of national minorities who could be suspected of disloyalty in case a war came. So there was a German minority in Russia that had been there for 200 years. It was feared they would be disloyal. So they were rounded up and executed. Poles living on the borderlands between the Soviet Union and Poland, it was feared that they would turn on the Soviet Union in case of a war, so they were also targeted and victimized, not for anything they did, but just for the language that they spoke, basically.
So it was a completely cynical thing. It went on for about 18 months, and then there were several incidents which even Stalin realized made it impossible to go on. For instance, there was a low-temperature laboratory in Moscow, and they'd arrested so many of the scientists that it was about to explode and destroy a large amount of the new Russian underground that was being built. And so they decided to reverse things. The little chief of police, Nikolai Yezhov, had become a drunk, completely drunk, and was stopping to turn up for work. And Stalin decided to get rid of him. So the Great Terror came to a fairly sudden end towards the end of 1938. And 1939 became a sort of almost paradise year in which you could write what you liked, you could walk the streets, you could say what you liked, and nobody seemed to be bothered. It didn't last long, but it was an extraordinary period, 1939. If you look at the books that were published then, and you can see Stalin started relaxing. After the Great Terror, he was in some ways morally exhausted. It may be that he realized that it couldn't go on, that he'd be left with no population to rule.
By the late 1930s, the changing nature of Europe refocused Stalin and the USSR's attention on global rather than internal affairs.
The great hope at the outset of the Bolshevik Revolution was that this would spread to other countries, notably Germany, which was seen as ripe for a similar sort of Bolshevik revolution. But it didn't happen, and events changed rapidly in the 1930s. Germany becomes the dominant power in Europe. Hitler is the dominant personality in Europe, and Stalin recognizes this.
Stalin wanted to safeguard the Soviet Union as much as possible. He regarded Hitler as his first enemy, but he also regarded the Western democracies, France and Britain and America, as capitalist enemies, who after all had intervened to try and destroy the Soviet Union in the Civil War. So he was very suspicious of them, perhaps more suspicious of them. At least, I suppose, he thought that the Nazism, a fascist movement opposed to communism, at least came from revolutionary popular roots and was run by a leader, a single leader like himself with whom he could do business. And so as war became closer and the pressure rose in Europe, he needed to make a decision on sides.
Stalin's ultimate decision would be made behind closed doors when Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister of Nazi Germany, headed to Moscow in August of 1939 to meet with his Soviet equivalent, Vyacheslav Molotov. A pact between the two nations was being prepared.
In 1939, Stalin accepted that sooner or later he was going to have to fight Hitler. But he did not believe that either it suited the Soviet Union for it to happen soon, or that the Soviet Union was ready to do so. He also saw the opportunity for territorial booty in Finland, in Romania, in Poland, which he was happy to seize. And Stalin convinced himself that he was offering Hitler such a good deal with oil, wheat, and many other commodities of which Germany was in desperate need, that he was confident that it was going to be left to him, Stalin, and the Soviet Union to choose the moment at which he confronted Hitler in arms. What he did not recognize was that his timetable and Hitler's timetable might not mesh.
In the end, Stalin's predictions about the timetable of the war in Europe would prove disastrously wrong. In August 1939, it was publicly announced that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had signed a non-aggression pact. The news would cause shockwaves around the world.
The lights began to burn all night in Moscow. British and French military missions arrived to confer with the Soviet government. So did German representatives. And on August 21st, 1939, the world was set on its heels by the announcement of a treaty between the Russians and the Germans in which they agreed not to fight each other. Here were the admitted arch-enemies in a state of apparent friendship. It was too fantastic to make any sense. It didn't.
When the news of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was announced to the world was absolutely stunned. This had all taken place in secret. All the negotiations had taken place behind closed doors. No one could quite believe in the West that Stalin would do a deal with his arch-enemy, Hitler. But also inside the Soviet Union, there was deep and profound shock that Hitler, who'd been presented by the regime as the ultimate monster, suddenly Stalin was sitting down and doing a deal. Not just a deal, but signing a non-aggression pact with him.
Well, Stalin and the Soviet leaders were very much afraid of Hitler's intentions, starting from when Hitler came to power in 1933 with an avowed anti-communist platform. One of the first things Hitler did was to outlaw the German Communist Party and imprison the German communists. It was starting in 1936, therefore, the Soviet Union adopted a policy of support for popular fronts, trying to rally all socialists and all moderates in popular fronts against fascism. So they were very much trying to join an international coalition to fight Nazism and to fight fascism. From 1936 to 1939, Stalin was trying to join various collective security pacts with Britain and with France, but they were not letting him in. And when Stalin was excluded from the Munich agreements, he began to feel that he was going to be excluded from any protection that collective security might give the Soviet Union. So then they started negotiating on the other side for some sort of pact with Hitler that would protect them.
Many communists in Western Europe and in the United States were deeply bewildered by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was something completely unexpected, something they could not reconcile with their enormously high ideals. But in the end they did so. They believed that the Comintern and the Kremlin must know what they were doing, and so they went along with it. But it did sow extraordinary confusion in the minds of Western communists.
So it was a cynical thing to do, to suddenly announce that the Germans were your friends and to start imprisoning people that you denounced Hitler in their books and articles at Communist Party dictate. And for 2 years, of course, this was official policy. We collaborate with Hitler because at least he's fighting the capitalist West.
Just over a week after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was announced, Nazi Germany invaded the western half of Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. Only a couple of weeks later, the Soviet Union took over the eastern half of Poland in exactly the way that the two nations had secretly agreed.
Part of Poland passed over to the Soviet Union, and the 3 independent Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were also handed over to the Soviet Union, which gave them more space between them and the expanding German Reich, which they hoped would help them if and when an invasion came.
He thought, and he did, he thought he'd get the Baltic states, he'd get half of Poland, and that half of Poland irritated him enormously because it was the half of Poland he had lost in 1920 when he was in charge of the war there, and it had been settled by Polish officers. So he took great care when he, under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he was entitled to take over that part of Poland to slaughter 22,000 Polish officers who were taken prisoners. And in fact, it made it much easier to cushion the eventual Nazi invasion.